Good to be back with you for our Sunday message on Ganubi Methodist Online. Some of us may have experienced the Wachabiki tree, and if we have, those memories won't be pleasant. It's a tree with lots of shiny green leaves, which looks so nice and shady if you're out in the hot sun. But those little thorns under the leaves will grab onto you before you know it, and the more you move or struggle to get away, the more they grab, and the more stuck and sore you get. I'm reminded of that scene from the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, when poor Miss Thompson gets herself stuck in the Wachabiki tree, translated wait a bit tree in the movie, while she's busy changing. Eventually, she has to surrender her dignity and shout out for Mr. Stain to come and rescue her from the painful grip of those thorns. Well, our scripture for today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. We'll be looking at verses 30 through 37. May the Lord bless his word to our lives. Jesus' disciples were the ones closest to him and had been the first to respond to his call to follow him. They were the ones who knew Jesus best. And Peter had recently declared to Jesus and to the others that he had truly come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So just after that, Jesus began to let his disciples into God's plan, that Jesus would have to suffer and die. Jesus needed to prepare his disciples for what was going to happen to him, so that when it did, they didn't give up hope, because they would know that this was all part of God's plan. In fact, seeing things happen exactly the way Jesus said they would should increase their faith. And so, again, in our passage, Jesus takes time to teach the disciples God's plan. Let me read from verse 30 of our passage in Mark chapter 9. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. Now, when Jesus had first mentioned God's plan, Peter had refused to accept it, and Jesus had rebuked him because he was rejecting God's will. That's in Mark chapter 8 and verse 33. And now again, we're told that they still didn't understand and were too afraid to ask. But isn't that human nature? When there's a hard truth to face, they didn't want Jesus to die. They loved Jesus. They loved being with Jesus. And where would it leave them if Jesus was killed? Hearing about Jesus dying was just too awful for them to want to understand or deal with. And we can sympathize. No one likes hearing or dealing with bad news, whether it's a painful reality we need to face or a hard truth we need to hear. We tend to deflect or defer or deny or defend or dispute anything but accept that. It's as though we suddenly find ourselves in the grip of thorns, and our instinct is to run or fight our way out. But we can't escape the facts. And the more we try to run or fight, the more painfully entangled we become. And here, the disciples were experiencing God's truth, spoken to them by Jesus as being very thorny to them. That's because it didn't suit them. It didn't align with their understanding or desires or hopes. And we have the same struggle. Like Peter and the disciples, we absolutely believe that Jesus is Lord. But there are times when his ways don't align with our understanding or desires or hopes. And God's truths seem especially thorny when they prick our consciences about our character or our conduct or our choices. You see, it's in our human nature to protect self first at all costs. When Adam and Eve sinned, they tried to hide themselves from God rather than face the truth. No child needs to be taught how to lie to save themselves from trouble. It's human instinct. And it is this very instinct to protect self that causes us to avoid or fight truths that we perceive to be a threat to self or self-interest. And yet, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." That's in John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32. So it turns out that avoiding or fighting God's truth will just keep us trapped in all that's hurting us. But embracing God's truth sets us free. This theme about human instinct to protect self and self-interest continues through our passage. Let me read verses 33 and 34. They came to Capernaum. When Jesus was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. If Jesus was going to die, then it seems that the disciples began to argue about which of them would replace him as leader of the group. Never mind that Jesus was facing death. Can you see it? That instinct to look after self first. And did you pick up that when Jesus questions them about their argument, they don't want to answer? Again, they avoid being confronted by the truth. But we are told exactly what they had argued about. Which of them is the greatest? That instinct to look out for self first, to elevate ourselves above the rest, or put others beneath ourselves, to seek our own best first. As we can see from the disciples arguing, this me first trait erodes relationships in our homes, amongst friends, in the workplace, and at church. It's this trait that makes saying, "I am sorry, I was wrong," some of the hardest words for us to say. And we've seen that it's the same me first instinct that gets in the way of our relationship with God when his truth doesn't suit us. But like being caught in the grip of the wachabiki, this urge to fight for self, to refuse to surrender, to be dominant, to be in control, to be free of anything that constrains us, even from God, it just piles on the pain. And so Jesus sits down with his disciples again, this time in someone's home, to teach them another truth. I'll read from verse 35. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, they must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Okay, so to show us just how strong and subtle this drive to put self first really is, Jesus says, from now on, Put yourself last and make it your goal to be a servant to everyone else. I'm sure we can already feel ourselves resisting that teaching, which in part is Jesus' point. Let me give you a personal example. I recently went for my vaccination. We had booked our appointment, but when we arrived, there was a long queue to get in. Did I put myself at the end of the queue and wait like everyone else had to wait? No, I had a booking, and I was quite pleased, even though a little bit sheepish, to be exempt from standing in the queue. I found myself trying to soothe my conscience. But you booked. And here's the subtlety of how this trait pervades society, pervades humanity as the norm. The very fact that I had booked shows I was already thinking, me first. This is the human way. But as Proverbs 14:12 tells us, there is a way that seems right to people, but in the end, it leads to death. Jesus came to rescue us from the way that leads to death. And he came to bring us back to God's way of life. And so he teaches his disciples, God's way is that if you want to be first, you need to be the very last. And applying this to the disciples' argument, well, actually, chaps, God says that to be the greatest, you need to be the very least. And then Jesus shows them what he means. In those days especially, children had no status amongst adults at all. They listened, they obeyed, and they served in the home. So Jesus breaks social norms and he brings a child to take center stage in this company of adults. And then he takes the child in his arms, making the child the focus of his love and attention, and says, anyone who for my sake is willing to set self aside, to make even a lowly child feel wanted, important, and special, they've in fact welcomed me and therefore welcomed God. Now, in that society, it was apt for Jesus to use the example of a child to make his point. But he's really including anyone that we see as being something less than us. Anybody in a weaker position to us, whether because of their age or their gender or education, wealth, ability, physical strength, appearance, popularity, social acceptability, emotional disposition, institutional power, or hierarchical position. For all of these examples and more, Jesus is saying, though we may consider somebody to be less than ourselves, we need to treat them as being more than ourselves. Now, we may be thinking that Jesus is asking the impossible of us. And without him, it is impossible, because we are well and truly caught in the thorn tree of our fallen nature. Our only hope is to recognize that we're stuck, that it's impossible for us to get out, and to surrender self and cry out to Jesus to rescue us. And when we do, he will. Jesus said, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. That's also in John chapter 8, verse 34. And here's the thing. Jesus accepted a crown of thorns, accepted being nailed to a tree so that he could set us free. In coming to earth, Jesus put himself right into the thorn tree of our world and took our sin, our wounds, our brokenness, our helplessness to rescue us from captivity that kept us apart from God. The Lord over all creation didn't cling to self at all costs, but he accepted humiliation on a cross for even the least on earth. Have a look at Philippians 2 from verse 3 to verse 12. That death of Jesus that his disciples didn't want to accept at first is the way to freedom for us all. Because on that cross, Jesus took our place to set us free. Even the least on earth, even the most tangled in sin, who cry out to Jesus to rescue them, Jesus himself comes to us and he sets us free, washes us clean, heals our wounds, and makes us loved, accepted, and honored children in his glorious kingdom. And once we have received such a great salvation from Jesus, and it dawns on our souls how Jesus, God's own Son, humiliated himself on that cross for us, then we begin to see self in terms of Christ's glory and God's mercy to us. And then fighting to be top dog, to have things my way, begins to lose its appeal. Instead, we start to find that it's in laying self low at the foot of the cross that we experience true freedom and satisfaction of soul. I begin to realize that until Christ came to lift me up, I was the least, and yet he lifted me. And then, in living for Christ and with Christ, we strive to extend that same mercy to everyone else, knowing that in living God's way, we will enjoy God's pleasure and God's eternal rewards. God bless you.